If there is anyone who can speak authoritatively on former President Donald Trump's skulduggeries, it is Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and writer David Cay Johnston. David, often described as Dean of Trumpologists, has reported on Trump since 1988 with withering scrutiny. With barely 2 weeks to go for the presidential election on November 5th, and close to 15 million Americans having already cast their votes, the race seems like anybody's game between Trump and his Democratic rival, Vice President Kamala Harris. With over 50 years of outstanding reporting of a complex set of American issues to his credit, 4 of Johnson's 8 books on economics, tax policy, and Donald Trump have been New York Times bestsellers. Currently a professor of practice at Rochester Institute of Technology and a regular guest at major TV networks, he spoke to Mayank Shah Reports, offering some remarkable insights into the former president's mind. David Cay Johnston. Welcome to Mayank Shah Reports, Mr. Johnston. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Well, glad to be here, and just David or David Cay, please.
Wonderful. Congratulations on all your success, and I've been watching you on various networks, especially CNN, and always struck by some of the observations that you make about former President Trump. We're looking at someone who has had 34 convictions, someone who has been held liable for sexual abuse in a civil trial, someone who's facing very damning charges of holding on to classified documents, and not to mention the virtual coup that was attempted to be staged. And yet he remains a reasonably viable presidential candidate to win in another 2 weeks. Explain this staggeringly mystifying phenomenon.
Well, first, I want to make sure your audience knows that I have covered Donald Trump longer than anyone else since 1988. In fact, in 1988, on July 10th of that year, I wrote about Donald becoming president of the United States someday.
Right.
And I have followed and paid attention to him for a very simple reason. As soon as I met him, I realized from our first long sit-down interview that he's a con artist, that he literally doesn't know anything. He's appallingly ignorant. I mean, he had to be told by his chief of staff, General Mark Kelly, when he was being taken to the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor, why it's there. This is a man who doesn't understand December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. Donald claims to be the world's greatest expert on 22 subjects. Well, first of all, nobody's the world's greatest expert on any subject, but nobody on 22 subjects. And one of the subjects he claims that he is the greatest expert of all time is tax policy. Now, I have a worldwide reputation for my knowledge of tax policy. My reporting in the New York Times caused 2 presidents to change their policies, many things to happen. 15 people went to prison. Some of them died there because of my reporting on taxes. And enough so that when I left the New York Times, I was hired by Syracuse University College of Law and its graduate business school to teach tax.
Right.
And I'm not a lawyer. Never taken a law school course in my life, but I've lectured all over the world on it. Donald was asked once under oath, well, what do you know, Mr. Trump, about accounting? I don't know anything about accounting. You don't, well, surely you understand the basics of accounting. I don't know anything about accounting. And he's tied down 6 ways on this issue. Why does that matter? Well, because you cannot understand tax if you don't understand accounting. I had to learn it. That's why I was able to teach in the Graduate School of Accounting at Syracuse. I now teach at Rochester Institute of Technology.
Right.
But so now, having said that, Donald's appeal stems from a couple of easily identified issues in America, and issues I've been writing about for decades. First of all, the economics of the bottom 90% of Americans, the 300 million of the 330 million Americans.
Right.
In 2016, the bottom 90% made compared to 1973, less money. They only got paid basically till Thanksgiving Day. That's the fourth Thursday of November. So the last 5 weeks of the year, adjusted for inflation, compared to 1973, they had no money. In addition, in 1973, if you had a job with a quality employer, you had health care. That was entirely on top of your wages. Nothing came out of your paycheck. Right. Today, most of the cost of health care, if you have it from your employer, is deducted from your paycheck, further reducing your cash income. If you had a pension, that was entirely on top of your salary or your wages. And today, it comes out of them through retirement savings plans. The result is that in 2016, the 90% really only got paid through about the middle of October, maybe later October. Going 2 months effectively with no income is a dramatic decline in people's well-being.
Right.
And just today, I was talking with a young journalist who's going to go out in the job market and is hoping to get paid in his first job $30,000 US. And I pointed out that in 1968, when I was 19 years old and was hired as a staff writer at one of the biggest newspapers in America, which at least for a few weeks displeased my colleagues, but they came around.
Right.
My base salary was $65,000 in today's money. And with overtime, I was making close to $80,000 in today's money. And this young person was just stunned, and I don't blame them. But what we've seen in America is that for many, many occupations, airline pilots, journalists, school teachers, police officers, their relative income to 1973 is way down. And largely because of the money withheld from their paychecks for what we used to call fringe benefits. Well, Donald appeals to these people. And they don't understand what's happened to them. I wrote a series of best-selling books explaining it, but, a few 100,000 people buy each of those books.
Right.
In a country of over 300 million people, it's bupkis. So that's the first group, the bottom 90%. Now, the second group are people who hate the civil rights movement but can't say that publicly, or certainly couldn't before Donald came along. So if you do not want to sit next to a Latino in the airplane, you don't want to have a black woman in the cockpit, and you don't want to have an Asian man who's your boss, Donald is appealing to you with his racist appeals. His promises to make America great again, that's code for make America white again, where people of color know their place and shut up and put up with it. And it's terrible to recognize that tens of millions of Americans, they love that. They think that's great. They think white people are inherently superior, despite all the evidence that there's no evidence to support that claim. The third group are what I call the fake or faux, F-A-U-X, the faux Christians. These are people who believe that the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New, is about getting rich, about oppressing people you don't like, about hate. And now I'm a non-believer. Let me be clear about that. Right. But I've also been a paid consultant over the years to most of the major denominations in the U.S., and I've given lectures at several of our largest divinity schools because of my deep knowledge of biblical history. And some of that I taught in my courses when I was teaching the law of the ancient world.
Right.
And it's astonishing how many Americans think that, Jesus wants you to be rich. Jesus wants you to turn away the stranger, to deny food to the poor and starving. Absolutely astonishing. Now, these three groups, the bottom 90% economically, the people who hate the civil rights movement, and the fake Christians, they overlap. If you draw what's called a Venn diagram, there's a huge overlap.
True.
And Donald is brilliantly exploited the fears and the ignorance of these people. At every rally, he says, "We love the poorly educated." Donald doesn't love anybody, including himself. Donald is a miserable human being. But people who are in these groups, they feel dumped on by American society. We've created a society in America where instead of judging you by the content of your character, as Martin Luther King said, we're not even necessarily judging people by the color of their skin. We're judging many of them by the contents of their wallet, or in Donald's case, the claimed contents of his wallet, since he's not now and never has been a billionaire, something I exposed starting in 1990 when I revealed that his own financial net worth statement showed he wasn't a billionaire when he claimed he was worth $3 to $5 billion, depending on who he was talking to any day. So Donald's appeal is to these people who feel, gee, I'm not as well off as dad or grandpa. Why did grandma and mom, why were they better off than I am? And they don't understand the reasons for it. And they have to do with fundamentally with government policy, weakening unions, trade rules, subsidizing companies to move jobs and investments offshore, creating a tax system in which I showed 25 years ago that many large corporations and some individuals literally make a profit from the income tax. I'm sure some people listening right now are going, what are you talking about? The simple answer to that. Imagine you owe $1 million in tax today. You find a device that lets you delay paying for 30 years. You invest the $1 million for the 30 years. In the future, that $1 million to the government is only worth, say, $500,000 because of inflation. But you, by investing the money, have turned it into, say, $3 million. So you pay the $1 million tax at the end of the 30 years, and you've got $2 million. You're richer. You've made a profit off the tax system. And when I first reported this, the New York Times was flooded with calls and emails and complaints to editors that I was this crazy person who didn't know what I was doing. Congress did a study, the largest study ever done by the Joint Committee on Taxation Staff, a 3-volume, 1,800-page report that showed I was exactly right. And in fact, Enron, a big company that collapsed back then, they literally were putting a rubber stamp on documents in the tax department that said profit center.
That is astonishing. You know, there are several points that you made, and all of them have jumped out at me. But I had one last question, which I'm going to advance because you made a reference to 4 Christians. I was listening to some of the interviews the other day, and some of these devout, so-called devout Christian followers of Trump's say that he has been chosen by God despite his imperfections, and perhaps even because of his imperfections. How is it that in this century we have in the world's most advanced country who think like that?
Well, I'm not sure we're the world's most advanced country. Okay.
Personally, you are, right? There are trimmings of advancement that most other countries don't have.
Well, yes, but let me give you a little shocking statistic. The last National Literacy Survey done in 2019 found that 22% of Americans, that's more than 1 in 5, read at the level of an 8-year-old, a 3rd grader or below. And 54%, so more than half, read at the level of a 6th grader or below. We've had a really serious decline in education in this country. And that's part of why Donald says, you know, we love the poorly educated. Secondly, it's the human condition. There will always be people who are authoritarian, people who are opposed to authoritarian views. When I was exposing the worldwide political spying operation of the Los Angeles Police Department 40 years ago, and the city council finally took some action, one of the leaders of the movement opposing the police spying turned to me and said, well, thank God it's finally over. And I said, it's not over. It'll never be over. Police departments need to have an intelligence function. They just shouldn't be allowed to run free and do all these terrible crimes that I revealed the LAPD did. But you need to have an intelligence function. issues about liberty, about distribution of the fruits of an economy, those are eternal issues that are baked into who we are. We're not a flock of geese. We're not a herd of buffalo. And so we have to, for our species, have a set of rules, and they matter. There are a lot of people in America who believe that Donald Trump is God incarnate. I've actually gotten calls and emails from people about this. But many people, he's God's messenger. And there are American supporters of these faux Christian religions, and Jeff Charlotte and others have written excellent books about this, who will tell you that Pol Pot with his massacres, Mao Zedong, Stalin, Hitler, those were God's agents, that God appointed them. Well, if you can have God justify the existence of Hitler and Pol Pot, I would say you have a God you can justify anything you want. It has nothing to do with morality or decency. And, every ancient religion that I've studied, and I had to do a lot of that when I was teaching the law of the ancient world, they all have the same fundamental message. Be nice to other people, have regard for other people, take responsibility for what you do. And if you live in an oppressive regime, don't surrender to it inside, only surrender to it in the outside. I would argue that the New Testament in the Christian Bible is the war literature of a defeated people, a vanquished people.
Right.
And who are trying to cope with these monsters from Rome who rule their lives. And Donald, a man who has no religious beliefs or views whatsoever, he says he's a Christian. He was asked once on a radio show right here in Rochester, New York, well, Mr. Trump is a Christian. Would you tell us about the last time you asked God for forgiveness? Now, my reading of the Bible is if you're a Christian, you are supposed to constantly be in a state of seeking forgiveness because you're constantly doing things that offend other people. And Donald's answer was, there's this pause, and then he goes, well, no, why would I do that? I've never done a single thing in my life that would require asking forgiveness of anyone. I'm sorry, what more do you need to know about the man's complete narcissistic self-attention?
Not much more, I agree.
Yeah.
To change gears a bit, your last book, The Big Cheat, begins with something you believe should have got much more attention than it did. And as an illustration of Trump's skulduggeries, you write about how professional actors were hired when he was announcing his candidacy. Each one was paid something like $50 for 3 hours appearance of just exulting at every step of the way.
Yeah, when Donald announced in June 16th of 2015 that he was running again for president, he came down the escalator. There were these cheering crowds of people wearing T-shirts. And he goes into this racist diatribe, murderers and rapists. And I'm thinking to myself, this is Midtown Manhattan. This is one of the most liberal places in America. This is a place where the civil rights movement has been very, very successful. It's not home to a bunch of racists. Did they bus in people from somewhere out in the countryside somewhere where you can find folks like that? And the very next day, The Hollywood Reporter, a trade publication that covers the entertainment industry, runs a story that there was an ad that had run in a publication for actors and wannabe actors and extras. If you showed up at a certain time at Trump Tower, they'd give you $50 if you just would wear a Trump T-shirt and on cue clap and applaud. And I thought, that should be the lead story the next day. Well, my former newspaper, the New York Times, if they reported it was inside the paper and only diligent readers would have seen it.
Right.
But it was the basis of his campaign. And this is the basis of everything Donald Trump does. With one exception, Trump University, which was shut down as totally fraudulent as it was, Donald never had $1 of his own money invested in any business anywhere. His casinos in Atlantic City, 100% borrowed money off of which he drew multimillion-dollar fees when he got the loans. And if you have a negative investment in everything, you then aren't really a business person. Donald Trump is a cash extractor, and his business is to trick people, to cheat people, to get them to give him money. And when the enterprise collapses, then he walks away. And he's been this way his entire life. He's not going to change at 78. He's just a little older than I am. But a lot of people believe he's this business genius. They don't understand that, no, he doesn't know how to run a business. When I was writing about his casino companies, his executives were telling me all the time about how he was messing the business up and screwing up and costing millions of dollars because he didn't know what he was doing, and how they would engage in these schemes to get him to not interfere in turning the profits, because their bonuses and things depended on actually making profits. And it's all a fraud. On the other hand, let me say, to compliment Donald, I've exposed many con artists in my career going back to the 1960s. A lot of people gone to jail or their careers ended, their businesses failed. Donald is the greatest con artist I have ever seen or known. He conned his way to the White House. He may con his way to the White House on November 5th. He's extraordinarily skilled at it. And the core of that is very simple. You claim you're something you're not, billionaire, magically successful businessman who loves America and cares about it. And you just repeat that all the time. And if something comes along that contradicts it, well, you never give an inch. You don't, one comma, you will not move a comma in your comments. And you attack the people who come after you. They're illegitimate, they're corrupt, they're dishonest. And it works. A lot of people just don't have the critical thinking skills to understand what he's doing. And that goes to this reading level, where more than half of Americans are reading at the level of a sixth grader or less.
That's stunning. That's stunning. You know, in that book, again, you talked about something which, again, should have got much more play than it did. While the world watched Donald Trump's presidency in horror or delight, few noticed that his lifelong grifting quietly continued. And then you make the point that during his stay in the White House, he made $1.7 billion.
Well, he took in that much revenue.
Revenue, yeah.
That's not profit, it's revenue.
No, true, but the revenue itself is staggering.
Right. Well, it is absolutely staggering. And, you know, some of his most profitable investments are in India, where he has his name on buildings. And I wrote about, I think in that book, they did 3.5 Trump books, so I'm not sure it was in that book. But in the case of India, you know, one of the problems the British left India with is this legal system where cases can go on for forever. Donald somehow magically suddenly got approvals for his buildings when nobody else could. Same kind of thing that he did in America. So presumably somebody got paid off. And he collects a lot of money from these businesses. And these businesses create terrible conflict of interest problems. The U.S. Constitution has a provision that the President of the United States may not receive anything of value from a foreign government or from the states, because America is a federal system. States are not subordinate to the federal government as a general rule. So we're not like Canada or France, where the provinces are subordinate. Right. And he's raking in this money. So he gets, under very dubious circumstances, the contract to run a hotel in the old post office in D.C., 5 blocks from the White House. On Inauguration Day, on his way to the White House, where almost nobody's on the streets to cheer him, unlike Obama, in bitter cold weather, people were curbed to building. It's a nice warm January day, and there's almost nobody cheering him. But he stops the presidential limousine about 5 blocks from the White House, and he and his wife and the kids all get out. They take a 2-minute turn on the asphalt. Not one TV station in America, not one newspaper the next day reported what I did, that he stopped in front of his hotel. But every single lobbyist, every single foreign diplomat, every spy agency in the world, intelligence service, they knew exactly where he stopped, and they got the message. You want something from Donald Trump's presidency, you will pay tribute. So the Saudi Arabian government would send people, and they would rent out entire floors of the hotel. and they would pay the rack rate. So, when you check in a hotel in America, there has to be a little sign on the back of the door on what's the maximum they can charge. So you might have paid $99 for the night, but the door says $527. They were charging the rack rate to everybody, every foreign government, which is ridiculous. Anybody who rents a whole floor goes in and negotiates a big discount. They didn't want a discount. And these were ways of paying tribute to Donald, of showing that, you were perfectly willing to put money in his pocket so long as you got the policies you wanted from him. It's utterly corrupt. And unfortunately, Trump's supporters in the House and the Senate would go, that's totally illegitimate. People are entitled to the freedom to pay whatever they think they should pay for a hotel room.
Right. Do you think Trump's continued sway over nearly half the electorate, now aided by someone like Elon Musk, is indicative of a deeper malaise, cultural malaise in America?
Oh, yes. Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, when I was exposing tax scams in the New York Times, big tax shelters companies were using, and did work that, according to Congress, saved taxpayers $250 billion in just 10 years. One of the things I wrote about were people in the accounting and law professions saying we've had a huge moral breakdown at the top. And I had written earlier, and I wrote about then, that the laws were changed in America on things like partnerships in a way that encourages and rewards vicious behavior by removing provisions that rewarded virtuous behavior. So historically, if you had a law firm or an accounting firm, it was called a limited partnership. And if you and I are partners, even though we've never met, because you're in the Chicago office and I'm in the Rochester, New York office, and I'm a crook and I'm ripping people off, you will end up the person who's the loser here. You will end up losing your house because I'm corrupt. So you're going to step in and say, hey, Johnston, what are you doing? Stop this. Well, the reverse of this is, under the new partnership rules, you're only at risk over my corruption if you inquire about it and learn about it. So long as you look the other way, I can go on doing my corrupt deeds. Now, I may go to jail at the end of the day, but you have no interest in exposing me and stopping me on behalf of the partnership.
Right. It gives me an interesting segue. As a professor and teacher, you have talked at length about the benefits of competitive market capitalism, even as you have focused almost single-mindedly on the concept of integrity.
Right.
Something which is unheard of in the character we are discussing right now.
Yeah.
How has that approach informed your writings about Trump? The fact that integrity is so crucial to the way you look at the world.
Well, one of the first things I learned about Donald is that he's just by nature dishonest. I mean, he learned as a young man that his father's only view was you had to win, and win meant get the money. And as long as you didn't get arrested or charged with a crime, it didn't matter what you did. It didn't matter that you lied, cheated, stole from people. You got the money. That was the measure. And so if you had grown up with a father like that, who was totally domineering over your life, you might well be like Donald Trump. Donald's older brother couldn't live with this, and he turned to alcohol. He became a pilot for TWA. His father told him what a useless waste of life he was. And in his 40s, he died from his alcoholism. Right. Donald surrendered to dad. So I've always held the view that an honest society is better off. And people can win by being corrupt, but they impose what economists call a deadweight loss on society. And this occurred, in my mind, in part because my father was a 100% disabled veteran of World War II. And all the years I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, he was dying right in front of my eyes. And about the age of 9, I realized what was going on and sort of became an adult as much as I could at age 9. And what I observed in my father's work was there were people he worked for who were honest and decent, and there were people he got hired by who were crooks. And I was appalled by the crooks. They had all this money, and they were going to cheat, waitresses out of money, and bus boys and dishwashers, and my father, an executive chef. It was just appalling to me that they would do this kind of behavior. And then I started working when I was 10 and full-time when I was 13, and I began to see the same thing of just bad behavior. And it troubled me, and it shaped a lot of my life. Part of the reason I became an investigative reporter, my goal in life was to become an LAPD homicide detective. I grew up in California.
Really?
I grew up in California, and I was going to join the LAPD. And instead, when I was still a teenager, the San Jose Mercury recruited me. They're now the 6th largest newspaper in America.
Yes.
And when I got hired, the people around me were sort of appalled. Teenage boy, what's going on here? In a few weeks, they turned around, and in a couple of years, I solved my first murder case, and I got on the front page a few weeks after I was hired. So it worked out okay. But news is about telling the truth. This is the only occupation where you get paid to tell the truth. Your doctor tells you, you're going to be gone in 6 weeks. He's telling you the diagnosis. He isn't being paid to tell you the truth. Journalists, we are paid to tell the truth. Unfortunately, we have some quote unquote news organizations that are like the faux Christians, Fox News being one of the examples, but they're not alone. There's Newsmax and Breitbart and other places where they knowingly lie to you. Fox just paid $787.5 million for knowingly lying, and they have another case of similar size that's pending. And they were lying, and they knew they were lying. That's a terrible development. Donald, by the way, has brilliantly told his followers, you can't trust anybody but the news organizations I tell you to trust. So if it's in the New York Times, it's in the Washington Post, it's on CNN or MSNBC, it's a lie. Never mind that all the evidence shows that's not the case at all. And his followers believe that. I mean, I've had many people say to me, oh, yeah, you used to work for the New York Times. So you're just a paid liar.
Right.
And one of the things I say to people like that, by the way, is, I've been writing about Donald for 36 years. I've written about him being involved up to his eyeballs with one of the biggest cocaine traffickers in America, for whom he did extraordinary favors that make no sense unless they were business partners on the QT.
I see.
And Donald has hired the very best litigators in America to come after me. I mean, lawyers who charge more than $1,000 an hour and are famous for their success. He's never gotten a correction in 36 years. So I'm sorry, you think I'm the liar. How do you explain that? Well, the laws allow you to lie. It's like a cult. There's no willingness to engage in a different set of facts. George Lakoff, the cognitive scientist, now emeritus at UC Berkeley, who was very kind to give me private lessons, in effect. One of the things he teaches is that if you have this authoritarian bond with a father figure like Trump, as opposed to a nurturing bond with a political leader who's a woman or as a man who's nurturing, it's very hard to break the bond with the father figure. But if you can break it, oh my, does it really get broken? And that's what Donald works very hard to avoid. He doesn't want people breaking from him.
That's fascinating, yeah. Just last couple of things, David. One is, how do you view Trump's economic policy, if he has any? I mean, he has proposed 20% tariff on all goods from all countries and 60% from China.
Yeah.
And also contrast it with Kamala Harris's while you are at it.
So the important thing to understand about a tariff is that tariffs protect domestic manufacturers. If you're a developing or poor country, if you're the United States in the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century, you want tariffs. And so imagine you own a car company here in America and you sell cars for $10,000 wholesale to the distributors, and you make $1,000 profit off each car. Right. And the Chinese make cars they import to America for $10,000, and they're making $1,000. Trump imposes a 50% tariff. That raised, or 60, I'm sorry, he said 60%. That 60%. Means that the Chinese, if you want to buy a Chinese car, you have to pay $16,000. It doesn't mean that people stop buying Chinese cars, because you, as the owner of an American company, Mayank, you're going to raise your price to $15,000 a car.
Right.
Now, you may sell a lot fewer cars, but you're going to make a $6,000 profit on each car. So even if car sales fall by half, you're richer. This is a scheme to redistribute money from the 90% to the people who own businesses, the already wealthy. Donald doesn't understand that. He says, and I believe he thinks this based on my decades of covering him, he really believes the Chinese people will be paying this tariff. And he has a degree in economics from Penn, but I've almost never been able to find someone who remembers even seeing him on campus. He was off getting credit for working on his father's apartment house project in Cincinnati. And he'll tell you, I studied at the Wharton Business School. Well, that's a graduate business school. There is an undergraduate, but no big shakes. And he studied in the one professor real estate department.
I see.
And so he didn't earn a degree from an Ivy League school. They gave it to him. And I'm sure there were corrupt matters in the background of this. And he claims he was a great honors student. There's no record anywhere of him having any kind of honors whatsoever. So Donald's plan is based on his assumption that, people will hate China and they don't know economics. And the fact is, most Americans don't know anything about economics. They don't understand savings and investment. Just the other day, I was talking with a liberal arts professor at another college here in Rochester who has put all her retirement money in bonds. And I was trying to explain to her, no, you don't do that. And she said, well, I don't want to lose any money. And I said, you're losing money left and right. You're going to have, growth above inflation of about 1%. If you're in the stock market, you'd have inflation plus 7-10% a year, maybe 5, but certainly a lot bigger.
Right.
And the compounding effect of that. Now, Kamala Harris, on her side, she is not proposing any new tariffs. I am sure that if she becomes president, she will use the authority Congress has given presidents to impose tariffs for strategic reasons, just as Trump would, but not on a broad blanket basis. You do it where you see, China starts dumping aluminum in America, we're going to put tariffs on Chinese aluminum. That kind of usage. She wants to increase tax benefits, tax favors for people in the bottom 90%. And they would be better off under her plan. 16 Nobel economists signed a letter that Donald Trump's tariff plan would plunge the country into a recession, would cost the average family $4,000 a year, which I thought was actually kind of conservative. And Harris's plan would promote growth.
Right.
Now, don't misunderstand me. The American tax system is a complete and total mess. My next book proposes an entirely new tax system. And I'm sure some people listening are going, yeah, newspaper reporter turned professor is going to create a tax system. That's a joke. It's been gone over by some of the very leading tax experts in America. And every single one of them says that would work. It would make the country much better off. It would work in every advanced country in the world. All of Europe, Japan, Australia. I'm not sure about India because I don't know enough about its tax system, but I suspect not. But it would encourage savings and investment and be much more efficient. So it's not some crazy pipe dream. The reason that book hasn't been finished was first Donald, for focusing on him for 9 years. And then secondly, I'm trying to write it at a level that people who only went to high school will understand the economics of it and the law.
I see. And to conclude, David, you're also for a smaller IRS and much more simplified federal tax system.
Right. We don't. Right.
Are these realistically achievable? I mean, I'm sure even left to them, even Trump and Musk would like the same thing, right?
Well, if you adopt my system, you don't need as big an IRS as you have because a lot of it is privatized and done in a way that rewards virtuous behavior and inherently punishes vicious behavior, and in very severe ways. I mean, ways that basically say you cheat as a provider, person who manages the tax system, you're going to lose your fortune, you're going to lose your ability to work in the field, and you're going to go to prison. Really tough penalties, whereas if you follow the rules and behave, you're going to have a wonderful, very lucrative business. And there's the U.S. tax code as printed by the U.S. government printing office. So the official version, it's 4,000 pages long almost.
Right.
I have not finished writing the actual code, which is harder than I imagined. But I think I'll have it done in under 200 pages.
Oh, really?
The reason the U.S. tax code is so bloated, not just the code, but also what's called the Internal Revenue Manual, the private opinion letters, etc., is favors. Oh, my company needs this special favor, and you get members of Congress to give them that favor. And a lot of these backfire. There was a man who flew an airplane into a building right into the windows where the IRS offices were in Austin, Texas, about 12 or 13 years ago that I wrote about.
Right.
He was driven to do this by a change in tax law sought by IBM that I had written about before that was supposed to raise $50 million so IBM could get a tax break to save them $50 million. I wrote about how it had been established that it actually cost the government money. It was a loser. It wasn't working, and it was making it very difficult for people who are freelance software coders and the jobs brokers who find them work to do their job. And this man finally was just driven crazy by it and ended up killing a decorated Vietnam War veteran who worked at the IRS in a low-level function. And the American tax code is just full of these favors. This chicken company gets a benefit, that one doesn't. This coal company gets a benefit that one doesn't. And there's no reason for this.
Right.
There's no reason for it at all. It doesn't help society at all. And then we lard up the tax system with all sorts of welfare programs. If you want to provide a subsidy to people with children, and I believe we should, and I am the father of 8 grown children, so I probably have some interest, though I won't benefit from this. Why do we do it through the tax system? Why don't we just say, oh, right now we give you a tax break that's worth about, on average, $1,000 a child in this country. Why don't we just write you a check every month that works out to be $1,000 at the end of the year?
Right.
That's the, get $85 a month. That would be a much more sensible way to do this, and it doesn't muck up the tax code. The reason you have a tax code is to raise the revenue. Very few Americans know this, but we live in the Second American Republic. The First American Republic, after 7 years, failed, and we replaced it. And why did we do that? Because under the First American Republic, there was no authority to tax. There were some other aspects. They didn't have an executive and whatnot. But the principal reason that we have the U.S. Constitution is we tax ourselves because of that Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts. That, along with the power to regulate interstate commerce, were the 2 driving reasons for the Constitution.
Right.
We don't teach that. We don't teach students in America that the Boston Tea Party was not a protest against high taxes. It was a protest against a tax favor, a tax exemption for the rich friends of King George. If you went to school in England, if you went to school in some schools in India, because some people I know who are part of the Indian diaspora tell me they learned this, but not all, you learned that what it really was.
Exactly.
And you learned that the claim that nobody knew who went and dumped the tea is nonsense. The portmaster wrote everybody's name down in a book you can go look up in the British Library, not the British Museum, the British Library in London. So, we don't teach an honest history in America, and people like Donald Trump exploit that to their benefit.
Absolutely. And before I let you go, just for the fun of it, who do you think is going to win?
Well, Kamala Harris will win the popular vote.
You think so?
Absolutely. And she'll win it by well more than 10 million votes. It's possible she'll win it by 15 million votes, depending on how good the ground game she's running is to turn people out at the polls. But we don't elect by popular vote. Donald Trump lost the popular vote both times, but he won the Electoral College the first time. So what matters are the 7 states that are in play. And I don't know how that's going to work out. I'm very troubled about this. I'm very troubled about polls showing that he is winning in a number of these states. And I would just point out that according to the pollster John Geraci, who lives here in Rochester, Rochester was always a big center of polling and surveys. He wrote a book called Poll Arise. And John told me one day that fewer than 1 in 100 people who answer the telephone will answer the questions. And in some polls, it's fewer than 1 in 200. So if that tiny segment are answering the questions, you may be able to check the box that you have the right number of Black women between 45 and 65 and the right number of Latino men between 19 and 30. But I don't think you have a true random sample.
I see.
I think you got some kind of self-selection bias going on. But we'll see. We're going to know. I don't think we'll know Tuesday night the 5th, but probably Wednesday or Thursday, we'll have a feel on it. If she really romps, then you'll see the U.S. move, I think, towards a much more fair society, less focused on welfare for billionaires, but only if the Democrats maintain at least 50 seats in the House, because then the vice president gets to tie-breaking votes and gets back the House. I think the Democrats will definitely get back the House. The Senate is a much tougher field for them now. 2 years from now, it'll be a much better field for them. So we'll see. But I mean, I don't know. I just know she'll win the popular vote by a very large margin.